On a summer evening in 1763, in the quiet village of Shepton Mallet, Somerset, a paralyzed man disappeared from his sister's porch without a trace. Owen Parfitt, aged somewhere in his 60s, simply ceased to exist in the space where he had been sitting moments before. No footprints led away from the scene. No witnesses saw anyone approach or depart. The farm workers laboring in the fields across the road noticed nothing unusual until they realized the old man was gone. This disappearance, though less famous than those of Amelia Earhart or the crew of the Mary Celeste, presents a puzzle that has defied explanation for more than 2.5 centuries. It touches on themes that resonate through human experience: the fragility of presence, the terrifying possibility of sudden absence, and the uncomfortable truth that some questions may never find answers. The England of 1763. To understand the disappearance of Owen Parfitt, we must first understand the world in which it occurred. The England of 1763 was a nation in transition, caught between the medieval past and the modern future. King George III sat on the throne, having ascended just 3 years earlier at the age of 22. The 7 Years' War had recently concluded with the Treaty of Paris, signed in February of that year, establishing Britain as the dominant colonial power and leaving France diminished in both the Americas and India. Yet for all Britain's growing power on the world stage, life in rural Somerset remained largely unchanged from what it had been for centuries. Shepton Mallet, a market town in the Mendip Hills, was known primarily for its wool trade and its production of stockings. The parish church of St. Peter and St. Paul dominated the skyline, its tower a landmark visible for miles around. The population numbered perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 souls, most engaged in agriculture or cottage industry. This was an England before industrialization had truly taken hold, before the enclosure movement had driven the rural poor into the cities, before the coming revolutions, both industrial and political, would transform the nation. It was a world of small communities where everyone knew everyone else, where strangers were noted and remembered, where the rhythms of life followed the seasons and the tolling of church bells. Transportation was by foot, horseback, or cart. News traveled slowly, often taking days or weeks to reach provincial towns from London. Scientific understanding was advancing but remained primitive by modern standards. The germ theory of disease lay a century in the future. Electricity was a curiosity demonstrated in parlor tricks. The prevailing worldview, even among the educated, still left room for supernatural explanations of inexplicable events. In such a setting, the disappearance of Owen Parfitt occurred. Owen Parfitt, A Life in Fragments. Of Owen Parfitt's life before his disappearance, we know frustratingly little. The historical record is sparse, consisting primarily of local accounts and later retellings that may have embellished or distorted the original facts. What follows is pieced together from these fragmentary sources. Parfitt appears to have been a tailor by trade, working in Shepton Mallet for most of his adult life. Some accounts suggest he had once been a man of some substance, perhaps even prosperity, but had fallen on harder times. Whether this decline was due to illness, misfortune, or simple economic circumstances remains unclear. By the early 1760s, Parfitt had become largely or entirely paralyzed. The nature of his condition is not specified in the surviving accounts. It may have been the result of a stroke, progressive neurological disease, spinal injury, or any number of other causes that 18th-century medicine could neither diagnose nor treat effectively. What is clear is that he had lost the use of his legs and possibly had limited mobility in other parts of his body as well. Unable to care for himself, Parfitt moved in with his sister, whose name has not survived in the historical record. She lived in a cottage on the outskirts of Shepton Mallet, in an area of scattered farms and fields. The cottage was modest but apparently adequate for their needs. His sister tended to Parfitt's daily requirements, and on pleasant days she would settle him in his chair on the porch, where he could observe the passing world. Those who knew Parfitt in his final years described him as a quiet man, resigned to his condition. He passed his days watching the comings and goings of rural life, farmers driving their livestock along the road, peddlers making their rounds, neighbors passing on their daily errands. It was a confined existence, but not necessarily an unhappy one. In an era before welfare systems or institutional care, living with family was the fate of many who could not work. Nothing in the accounts suggests that Parfitt had enemies or was involved in any disputes. He was simply an invalid approaching the end of his life, dependent on his sister's charity and passing his remaining time as pleasantly as his circumstances allowed. The day of disappearance. The exact date of Owen Parfitt's disappearance is not recorded with precision in the surviving accounts, but it occurred sometime in the summer of 1763, most likely in June or July, when the days were long and the weather encouraged sitting outdoors. The day began ordinarily. Parfitt's sister helped him dress and prepared his breakfast. The morning was fine, and as was their custom when the weather permitted, she settled her brother in his chair on the porch. The chair was positioned to give him a view of the road and the fields beyond, where he could watch the farm workers going about their tasks. The porch itself was a simple covered platform attached to the front of the cottage, open on three sides to the air. It offered shade from the sun while allowing Parfitt to enjoy the summer breeze and observe the life around him. His sister covered his legs with a blanket despite the warmth, as invalids were thought to be especially susceptible to chills. Having made her brother comfortable, Parfitt's sister went about her household duties. The cottage required constant attention: meals to prepare, clothes to wash, the garden to tend, chickens to feed. She moved between the interior rooms and the yard, checking on her brother periodically but not remaining constantly by his side. He required supervision but not necessarily constant watching, as his paralysis meant he was unlikely to wander off or get into mischief. Across the road, separated from the cottage by perhaps 50 yards, lay fields where farm workers were employed in the seasonal labor of summer. The exact nature of their work is not specified. It may have been haying, weeding, or some other agricultural task, but several men were working within clear view of the cottage. These workers would later become crucial witnesses to what did not happen. The afternoon progressed normally. The sun climbed toward its zenith and then began its slow descent. Parfitt remained in his chair, visible to anyone who cared to look. His sister emerged periodically to check on him, finding him as she had left him each time. The farm workers continued their labor, their rhythmic movements marking the passage of hours. Then came the moment that would transform an ordinary summer day into an enduring mystery: the vanishing. Accounts vary slightly in the details, but the essential facts are consistent. At some point in the late afternoon or early evening, Parfitt's sister emerged from the cottage to bring her brother inside for his supper. She had last seen him perhaps 30 minutes to an hour earlier, sitting peacefully in his chair. Now the chair was empty. The blanket that had covered Parfitt's legs lay on the porch, either still draped over the chair or fallen to the floor. Sources differ on this detail. But of Owen Parfitt himself, there was no sign whatsoever. His sister's initial reaction was probably confusion rather than alarm. Perhaps he had somehow managed to move, though this seemed impossible given his paralysis. Perhaps someone had come to help him inside, though why they would do so without informing her was puzzling. She called his name, first from the porch, then moving through the cottage rooms, thinking he might somehow be inside. He was not. She searched the immediate surroundings, the small yard, the outbuildings, the garden. She looked in places where it would have been impossible for a paralyzed man to go unassisted, driven by the desperate hope that her eyes or her understanding had somehow deceived her. But Parfitt was nowhere to be found. By this time, alarm had replaced confusion. She called to the farm workers across the road, asking if they had seen anything. Their response only deepened the mystery. They had been working in full view of the cottage all afternoon, they insisted. No one had approached the porch. No cart or carriage had stopped at the cottage. They had seen no one carry or lead Parfitt away. Indeed, they had glanced toward the cottage periodically throughout the afternoon and had seen the old man sitting in his chair. Until, at some point, they had looked and he was gone. The search. What followed was an increasingly frantic search involving the sister, the farm workers, and soon, neighbors and villagers drawn by the commotion. They searched the cottage and its grounds thoroughly. They examined the road in both directions. They looked in ditches, behind walls, in any place where a body, for surely if Parfitt had moved or been moved, he could not have gone far, might be concealed. They found nothing. No trace of Owen Parfitt. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading away from the porch, though the ground was soft enough that such marks should have been visible. No evidence that a cart had stopped or turned around near the cottage. Nothing to suggest where Parfitt had gone or how he had been taken. Local authorities were notified, though in rural Somerset in 1763, this meant little more than involving the parish constable and possibly the local magistrate. These were not trained investigators, but ordinary men fulfilling civic duties. They made inquiries and organized more extensive searches, expanding the radius to include nearby farms and more distant reaches of the parish. Days passed, then weeks. The searches continued but found nothing. No body was discovered in the fields or streams. No one came forward claiming to have seen Parfitt or anyone carrying him away. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist in the moment between his sister's last check and the discovery of the empty chair. Rumors and theories proliferated in the close-knit community. Some whispered of supernatural intervention, the devil taking his due, or fairies spiriting the old man away. Others suggested more prosaic explanations. Perhaps Parfitt had enemies unknown to his sister, people who had borne grudges from his earlier life. Perhaps he had been involved in some intrigue that had caught up with him. Perhaps his paralysis had been feigned, and he had walked away of his own accord, though this seemed to contradict everything known about his condition. The sister herself came under suspicion, as family members often do in mysterious disappearances. Had she harmed her brother, perhaps in a moment of frustration at the burden of caring for an invalid? Had she fabricated the disappearance to cover a crime? But those who knew her insisted on her devotion to Parfitt, and there was no evidence of foul play, no body, no motive beyond speculation. Theories and explanations. In the centuries since Owen Parfitt vanished from his sister's porch, numerous theories have been proposed to explain his disappearance. None is entirely satisfactory. Foul play by unknown parties. The most straightforward explanation is that someone abducted or murdered Parfitt for reasons unknown to us now. Perhaps he had witnessed something he should not have seen. Perhaps he possessed information that made him dangerous to someone. Perhaps old debts or grudges from his earlier life caught up with him. The problems with this theory are substantial. Parfitt was paralyzed and sitting in view of multiple witnesses. To remove him would have required approaching the cottage, lifting him from his chair, and carrying or transporting him away, all without being noticed by either his sister, who was inside but moving about, or the farm workers across the road. The logistics seem nearly impossible, especially in daylight. Moreover, If someone wanted Parfitt dead, why take the body? Why not simply kill him where he sat and flee? The removal of the body suggests either a desire to conceal the crime, but from whom, when the disappearance itself would immediately raise alarm, or a purpose beyond simple murder. Complicity of the witnesses. Perhaps the farm workers were not as vigilant as they claimed. Perhaps they were involved in the disappearance themselves, or were paid or threatened to look the other way. In a small rural community, such conspiracies were not impossible. But this explanation requires us to believe that multiple people, who would have to maintain their story for years afterward, successfully conspired to abduct a paralyzed man in broad daylight without leaving any physical evidence. It also requires a motive that has never come to light and a level of coordination that seems unlikely among simple farm laborers. Voluntary disappearance. Could Parfitt have arranged his own disappearance? Perhaps his paralysis was exaggerated or had improved, allowing him limited mobility. Perhaps he had confederates who helped him escape a life he found intolerable. This theory is undermined by everything we know about Parfitt's condition and character. Those who knew him insisted he was genuinely paralyzed. Even if he could move more than people realized, where would he go? How would a penniless invalid in his 60s, with no apparent resources or connections, successfully vanish and establish a new life? And if he wanted to leave, why not simply ask to be taken to a workhouse or some other institution? Why stage an elaborate disappearance? Natural causes and animal predation. Perhaps Parfitt died suddenly on the porch, and his body was subsequently removed by wild animals. Large predators were rare in Somerset by 1763, but dogs or pigs capable of dragging away a corpse were common. However, this scenario would have left evidence: blood, torn clothing, drag marks. The porch and surrounding area showed no such signs. Moreover, it would have required the death and removal to occur within the brief window between the sisters' checks, and for the animals to completely remove or consume the body quickly enough that the immediate searches found no trace. The supernatural. In Parfitt's own time, supernatural explanations would have seemed plausible to many. The devil, angry spirits, fairy abduction, all were part of the belief system of 18th-century rural England. Some accounts of the disappearance, particularly later retellings, lean into these interpretations. Modern readers are likely to dismiss such explanations as superstition. Yet they reflect something important: the recognition that some events seem to defy natural explanation. When all rational theories fail to account for the facts, people reach for alternatives outside the rational framework. Misremembering and embellishment. Finally, we must consider that the story as it has come down to us may not be entirely accurate. Memories are fallible. Stories grow in the telling. Perhaps the farm workers were not as attentive as they later claimed. Perhaps the timeline was different than reported. Perhaps key details were added or omitted in subsequent retellings. The disappearance of Owen Parfitt became a local legend, passed down through generations. In that process, facts may have been altered, ambiguities resolved, mundane explanations forgotten in favor of mystery. We cannot interview the original witnesses or examine the scene ourselves. We are dependent on sources separated from the event by decades or centuries. This does not mean the disappearance did not happen or was not genuinely mysterious. But it suggests that the version we have inherited may be a simplified or dramatized account of more complex events. The aftermath. In the immediate aftermath of Parfitt's disappearance, life in Shepton Mallet continued, but the mystery cast a shadow over the community. His sister, whose name and subsequent fate are lost to history, presumably lived with questions that would never be answered. Did her brother suffer? Did he die quickly or linger in pain? Was he the victim of malice or some inexplicable accident? The cottage where Parfitt vanished likely became a source of superstitious dread, the kind of place people would hurry past after dark. Such locations acquire reputations that persist for generations, whispered about long after the original events are forgotten. Legally, Parfitt's disappearance would have created complications. In the absence of a body, he could not be declared dead for years. Any property he owned, if he owned any, would remain in legal limbo. His sister could not settle his affairs or inherit anything that might have been due to her. Over time, the immediate mystery faded from urgent concern to local legend. The generation that had known Parfitt personally died off, taking their first-hand knowledge with them. New mysteries and scandals arose to capture attention. Life moved on, as it always does. But the story did not die entirely. It was preserved in local histories and collections of strange tales. In the 19th century, as antiquarians and folklorists began documenting such stories, Parfitt's disappearance found its way into print. Each retelling added new audiences and sometimes new embellishments, until it became difficult to separate the original facts from later accretions. Similar disappearances. Owen Parfitt's vanishing is not unique in the annals of mysterious disappearances, though its particular circumstances are unusual. History records numerous cases of people who simply ceased to be, leaving behind questions but no answers. David Lang, a Tennessee farmer, allegedly vanished from his field in 1880 while walking toward his family, who watched him disappear in mid-stride. Orion Williamson supposedly experienced a similar fate in Alabama in 1854. Both cases are now considered likely hoaxes or greatly embellished retellings of more mundane events, but they share with Parfitt's story the central motif of instantaneous disappearance while under observation. The day began ordinarily. Parfitt's sister helped him dress and prepared his breakfast. The morning was fine, and as was their custom when the weather permitted, she settled her brother in his chair on the porch. The chair was positioned to give him a view of the road and the fields beyond, where he could watch the farm workers going about their tasks. The porch itself was a simple covered platform attached to the front of the cottage, open on three sides to the air. It offered shade from the sun while allowing Parfitt to enjoy the summer breeze and observe the life around him. His sister covered his legs with a blanket despite the warmth, as invalids were thought to be especially susceptible to chills. What distinguishes Parfitt's case from many others is its relative sobriety. Unlike the Lang and Williamson stories, which feature fantastic elements that mark them as likely fabrications, the Parfitt account is restrained in its details. The witnesses make no claims to have seen anything supernatural. They simply report that a man who was present became absent, with no explanation of how this occurred. The role of memory and legend. Understanding the disappearance of Owen Parfitt requires grappling with questions of memory, testimony, and the transformation of events into legend. The story we have inherited was not recorded contemporaneously by impartial observers but filtered through human recollection and repeated retelling. In 1763, news did not spread through newspapers and broadcasts but through word of mouth. When something unusual happened in a small community, people talked. They shared what they had seen and heard, speculated about causes, and told the story to others. Each retelling was an opportunity for details to change, for emphasis to shift, for dramatic elements to be enhanced. Psychological research has demonstrated that human memory is not a perfect recording device but a reconstructive process. We remember events through the lens of our expectations, beliefs, and subsequent experiences. Witnesses to the same event will recall different details, emphasize different aspects, and sometimes remember things that did not occur while forgetting things that did. This is not necessarily dishonesty. It is the nature of how minds work. When the farm workers said they saw no one approach Parfitt's porch, they were likely reporting their honest recollection. But honest recollection is not the same as perfect observation. They were working, not watching the cottage continuously. Their attention was divided. A brief distraction, a moment when all of them happened to be looking elsewhere, could have created an opportunity that later seemed not to have existed. As the story passed into legend, it would have been shaped by narrative conventions. Good stories have clear elements: the innocent victim, the mysterious circumstances, the witnesses who saw nothing, the searches that found no trace. Ambiguities would be resolved, contradictions smoothed away, mundane possibilities forgotten in favor of more compelling mystery. This process does not mean the disappearance was invented or that nothing unusual occurred. It means that the version we have received may be a polished narrative created over time from messier, more ambiguous raw material. The limits of historical knowledge. The case of Owen Parfitt confronts us with the limitations of historical knowledge. We want to know what happened, to solve the mystery, to provide closure to a story that has remained unresolved for more than 250 years. But some questions cannot be answered with the evidence available. We do not have access to the original witnesses. We cannot examine the scene or review physical evidence. We cannot conduct the kind of investigation that modern police would undertake, collecting forensic evidence, conducting detailed interviews, checking backgrounds and alibis. We are dependent on fragmentary accounts recorded long after the fact, and we must work with what they provide and acknowledge what they cannot tell us. This is frustrating but also instructive. It reminds us that much of history is irretrievably lost. For every event carefully documented and preserved, countless others left little or no record. People lived, suffered, loved, and died without leaving traces that later generations could study. Owen Parfitt's life before his disappearance is largely unknown to us. Had he not vanished mysteriously, we would likely know nothing about him at all. The disappearance itself survives in historical memory precisely because it was inexplicable. Had there been a clear explanation, it would have been just another death in rural England, noted by those who knew Parfitt and forgotten by history. The mystery is what preserved it, transformed it into a story worth telling and retelling. In this sense, Parfitt achieved through his disappearance a kind of immortality he would never have gained otherwise. An obscure tailor, paralyzed and dependent on his sister's charity, has been remembered for centuries because of the manner of his ending. His life was forgotten, but his absence endures. Reflections on mystery. Why do cases like Owen Parfitt's disappearance continue to fascinate us? What draws our attention to these unsolved mysteries from the past? Part of the appeal is the puzzle itself, the challenge of trying to solve what others could not. We believe, perhaps arrogantly, that with modern knowledge and analytical tools, we might succeed where previous generations failed. We construct theories, evaluate evidence, and debate possibilities, engaging with the past as detective story. But there is something deeper at work as well. These stories touch on fundamental anxieties about existence and meaning. The possibility of sudden, inexplicable vanishing challenges our sense that the world operates according to knowable rules. We want to believe that causes produce effects, that actions leave traces, that disappearances have explanations. When we encounter a case that seems to defy these principles, it unsettles us. Parfitt's disappearance reminds us that people can simply cease to be, leaving behind only absence and questions. In our own time, with missing persons databases and advanced investigative techniques, people still vanish without trace. The circumstances may differ from Parfitt's, but the essential mystery remains. A presence becomes an absence, and no amount of searching yields answers. There is also something poignant about these old mysteries. The people involved, Parfitt, his sister, the farm workers, the searchers, are all long dead. Whatever happened on that summer day in 1763, all those who knew the truth have carried it into silence. The urgency of the moment has faded, replaced by the calm of historical distance. We can contemplate the mystery without the emotional weight that those involved must have felt. Yet in reading about Parfitt's disappearance, we connect with those long-dead people and their experience of confronting the inexplicable. We share, across the centuries, their confusion, their search for answers, their eventual acceptance that some questions have no resolution. In this way, an obscure event in 18th-century Somerset speaks to timeless human experiences. On a summer evening in 1763, Owen Parfitt disappeared from his sister's porch in Shepton Mallet, Somerset. Despite being paralyzed, sitting in view of witnesses, and having nowhere obvious to go, he vanished without leaving a trace. No evidence of foul play was found. No body was discovered. No explanation was ever established. More than 2.5 centuries later, the mystery remains unsolved. We can speculate about what might have happened, construct theories to account for the known facts, and question the reliability of the sources. But we cannot know with certainty what became of Owen Parfitt. Perhaps that is the point. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, not because they are unsolvable in principle, but because the information needed to solve them has been lost to time. We are left with the story itself, a man who was present and then was not, witnesses who saw nothing, searchers who found no trace. The disappearance of Owen Parfitt stands as a reminder that reality sometimes defies our expectations and that the past contains secrets it will never reveal. It is a small mystery in the grand scheme of things, one man's fate in a world where millions have suffered and died anonymously. But it endures because it touches something essential in human experience: our need to understand, our fear of the unexplained, and our ultimate inability to answer every question that history poses. Somewhere in the English countryside, in records that have not survived or in memories that died with those who held them, the truth of what happened to Owen Parfitt may once have existed. Now we have only the mystery, preserved like an insect in amber, a glimpse of a moment when the ordinary world revealed its capacity for the inexplicable. And perhaps that is enough.